From left to right, these images show a forest fire near Goldbridge, BC in August 2023, houses underwater during flooding in Abbotsford, BC, November 2021, and the effect that a king tide and windstorm had on Vancouver's Stanley Park seawall in January 2022. British Columbia is preparing for more disasters and emergencies just like these. In 2024, the City of Vancouver released a hazard, risk, and vulnerability analysis. This analysis looks at possible hazards and how they might affect our communities. This report identified the hazards of greatest concern, which include earthquake, extreme heat, wildfire smoke and poor air quality, drought, snowstorm and extreme cold, coastal flooding and sea level rise, extreme rainfall, windstorm and power outage, disease outbreak, large structure fire, coastal spill, and hazardous materials release. Vancouver always has and always will face emergencies and disasters. Here is a timeline of select major events produced by the City of Vancouver in 2024. These events were selected to show the range and variety of hazards that we face. The first one is the Great Cascadia Earthquake and Tsunami of 1700. On the evening of January 26, 1700, a massive rupture occurred along the Cascadia Fault. This triggered an earthquake so powerful that it sent a tsunami across the Pacific Ocean. The tsunami reached the shores of Japan just hours later. Closer to home, the earthquake caused intense shaking that damaged the homes of the Cowichan people and led to multiple landslides. The tsunami that followed was devastating. It wiped out the village of Lota, killing all 5,000 residents. More than 40 indigenous nations along the Cascadia coastline, including the Huayet First Nation on Vancouver Island, have passed down stories of this event through oral tradition. These accounts describe the earthquake and tsunami in vivid detail. These stories preserved knowledge across generations long before Western science recognized the threat. Yet, despite these rich histories and expertise, building codes in the region didn't begin to account for seismic hazards until the mid-20th century. And it wasn't until the 1980s that geologists fully understood the potential for megathrust earthquakes in the Cascadia zone. 186 years later, just months after Vancouver was officially incorporated as a city, settlers lit 2 land-clearing fires on what is now the downtown peninsula. These fires quickly grew out of control. In less than 30 minutes, the Great Vancouver Fire destroyed all but 3 of the city's 1,000 buildings and claimed the lives of over a dozen people. As flames and smoke engulfed the city, settlers fled toward the Burrard Inlet, some swimming into the water to escape. Their survival depended on the swift and courageous actions of Squamish Nation paddlers, mostly women, who saw the smoke from across the inlet. They launched their canoes and crossed the water repeatedly, rescuing people from the shoreline and ferrying them to safety. Kristen Rivers is from the Squamish Nation and a direct descendant of one of the rescuers. Rivers says, quote, "Our oral traditions through song and storytelling tell us that dozens of canoes came over and my great-grandmother led the way. She saw people in the water. They picked them up in their canoes and brought them back to North Vancouver." In 2017, the City of Vancouver passed a motion to formally acknowledge the role of First Nations members who saved lives during the city's Great Fire. Vancouver City Councillor Andrea Reimer, who brought the motion forward, said acknowledging the courage, sacrifice, and honor of the families who had been evicted from the area and relocated to a North Vancouver reserve is essential. Hazards and disasters in BC are part of a deep history. The lands now known as Vancouver have long been home to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Their knowledge of these lands and waters spans generations, including expertise in the natural hazards that shape life here. Just a few decades after the Great Fire, in the 1920s, the government of BC drained Sumas Lake in BC's Fraser Valley. This transformation was part of a broader settler colonial project to convert wetlands into agricultural land for capitalist development. Fast forward to BC's atmospheric river event of November 2021. The atmospheric river caused extreme amounts of rain due to warmer temperatures from climate change. We also know now that a key area of flooding was on the land that was previously Sumas Lake. As settler dikes failed and pumps broke down, Sumas Lake reappeared almost exactly 100 years after it was drained and turned into what is now called Sumas Prairie. The flood of 2021 submerged Sumas Prairie, causing massive damage, including the death of over 600,000 livestock and billions in economic losses. In other words, this flooding was not just a climate event, but a result of colonial decisions to reshape the land. All of these BC disasters illustrate in different ways how disasters are not just natural, they are social and fundamentally historical. We are going to ask a number of questions together about disasters in British Columbia and disasters around the world. For example, let's take a look at this map of the spatial distribution of Vancouver hazard risk. At the bottom, we see the mapping of hazards and risks from coastal flooding, sea level rise, poor air quality, extreme heat, and earthquakes. When we overlap each hazard, we get the composite map in the top right. What do you notice about how hazards and risks are distributed in Vancouver? In this map, the darker red areas such as Downtown East Side, East Vancouver, and South Marine are areas that have the highest overlapping hazard score, whereas the lighter pink areas, such as the western side of Vancouver, have the lowest overlapping hazard score. A key question for us is, what causes this inequitable risk distribution, and what can be done about it? We're talking about just a 10 to 20 minute drive from the lowest risk area to the highest. In some areas, risk shifts dramatically across just a city block or two. Now, of course, there are physical causes. Coastal flooding and sea level risk increase greatly in neighborhoods closer to the ocean and in lower lying areas. But physical differences cannot explain all or even most of the differences in risk shown on this map. In 2021, Peake and colleagues wrote, "Disaster risk is patterned in ways that reflect pre-existing social and economic inequalities." In other words, when a disaster strikes, its impact reflects the pre-existing conditions in that society. Disaster studies scholars seek answers to questions like, why are some communities more vulnerable to disasters, have a harder time responding when a disaster occurs, and are much slower to recover after disaster happens? When we say natural disaster, it sounds like nature alone is to blame. But sociologists, disaster studies researchers, and critical Indigenous disaster studies scholars argue that disasters are never purely natural. They are shaped by social systems. The phrase, "there is no such thing as a natural disaster," became central after Hurricane Katrina. This hurricane devastated New Orleans in 2005. The storm itself was natural, though connected to human climate change, but the disaster was social. For example, poor neighborhoods flooded first because of decades of discriminatory housing and levee placement. Human-made evacuation plans assumed everyone had cars, leaving behind thousands without transportation. And recovery efforts were shaped by things like discriminatory media narratives. And calling disasters natural hides these root causes: historical decisions, economic inequality, political neglect.